Senator from Illinois.
As consent, the quorum call be suspended.
Without objection.
Mr. President, the bill pending before us is the Cybersecurity Act, as it's known. And for most people, it's a term which they may have heard of but may not fully understand. It was about 2 months ago that members of the Senate, including yourself, were invited to a classified briefing. It was a briefing that Senator Mikulski of Maryland asked for to explain what this was all about. Because we've been hearing over and over again from the defense establishment in America that the #1 threat to America's safety and security was no longer just terrorism, it was cybersecurity threats and terrorism. And for most people, it's not quite sure. They've not seen any examples of it that could make a difference. So here's what we saw. They took us down to this classified room, closed the door, took away our BlackBerries and iPhones and put them in a separate place. I'll explain why they did that in just a moment. And then took us in the room and briefed us on an example, just a theory. What if a subcontracting company that supplied a major public utility in a city like New York had a problem and someone stole a laptop from one of the employees? And that theft went unnoticed or unreported for a number of days. And then the laptop either reappeared or didn't. What could happen? Well, what could happen was if that laptop computer had certain information in it that not only told you how to get into the computer system of the company, the subcontracting company, but also the public utility, bad things could occur. So getting inside that computer, laptop, getting inside the technology of the subcontractor, and then finding that bridge, information bridge, into the public utility could create an opportunity to turn out the lights in the city of New York. That was the exercise we went through. God forbid it would ever occur, but they said, when you turn out the lights in a major American city like New York, terrible things happen. Not only do the traffic signals stop and lights don't go on at night, and the New York Stock Exchange isn't operating, hospitals are on emergency generators, and problems start popping up in every single direction. Water purification, the pumps that keep the subway system under the city of New York going so that the subway tunnels aren't flooded. All of these things on top of one another. While this tragedy is occurring, the people in our government are trying to figure out what happened and how do we put things back into place and get them moving again. That was one example. There was another example. It was an example at one of our defense research laboratories, top secret. Nobody can get in, right? And they told us the example, and I won't even tell you the state where it was located. They told us an example where the employees at our top defense research laboratory who were trying to figure out countermeasures to stop attacks against the United States and to develop our own weaponry had what appeared to be a harmless email sent to the employees saying, explanation of your new health care benefits, just click below. It turned out that that click brought in the hackers into the system. So what we're talking about here has consequences that go far beyond the harassment of some teenage hacker who was trying to get into some company computer or even the school's computer. I was on a plane yesterday with a gentleman who is working for the National Institutes of Health, and I asked him about cybersecurity. He said, we think about it every day. Every day because hackers are trying to get into the National Institutes of Health technology and computer system. I said, what for? Well, some of them are in there for insidious reasons, but some of them are childish hackers. And I said, what do? Well, they'll come in, for example, and change our published list of antidotes to certain poisons. So we always have to keep an eye on it to make sure they haven't changed what doctors should use across America. Think about it. Think about all the possibilities. And what we're trying to do today is to come up with a line of defense for America. We are trying to establish a working relationship between all levels of our government and the private sector of the United States to keep us safe. Because what they told us was every single day, China, Russia, Iran are on the attack. Cybersecurity attacks into the United States, not just the ones I've mentioned, but far beyond. Defense contractors building the planes and the armaments and all the artillery and the like, they have to worry about whether or not their secret plans, their patented information is being stolen right from under them. Stolen by someone who wants to compete with them or perhaps wants to go to war with them. That's what's at stake here. So for a long time, we've been warned and forewarned to do something about it. The bipartisan consensus among defense and intelligence experts in the public and private sector is that our nation is dangerously vulnerable to cyber attack at this moment. The FBI director, Bob Mueller, an extraordinarily great public servant, says that the threat our nation faces from a cyber attack will soon equal or surpass the threat from al-Qaeda and more traditional forms of terrorism. Navy Admiral Mike Mullen, chairman of the Joint Chiefs, said, "The cyber threat has no boundaries or rules, and the reality is the cyber attacks can bring us to our knees," unquote. According to our Director of National Intelligence, James Clapper, countries like Russia and China are already exploiting our vulnerability. His unclassified assessment, what he told the public, is that entities within these countries are already, quote, "responsible for extensive, illicit intrusions into U.S. computer networks and theft of intellectual property," end of quote. We've got to respond to this, Mr. President, and we have to do it quickly. I want to thank Senators Lieberman, Collins, Feinstein, and Rockefeller for putting together this bill, the Cybersecurity Act of 2012. They've introduced an approach that is balanced, bipartisan, and responsive to legitimate concerns raised by the intelligence community, private industry, and privacy advocates. The Cybersecurity Act of 2012 will help make us safer. Our nation's critical infrastructure, power plants, pipelines, electrical grids, water treatment facilities, transportation systems, even financial networks are increasingly vulnerable to attack. Now, bad actors in other countries have already demonstrated their ability to use the Internet to take control of computer systems. Last year, there was a 400% increase in cyber attacks on the owners of critical infrastructure. This act has provisions that will reduce our vulnerability and shore up our defenses. In response to concerns raised by some in the private sector and some on the other side of the aisle, Senators Lieberman and Collins revised a section of the bill. The bill now creates a voluntary incentive-based system of performance standards. Private companies and government agencies will work together to determine the best practices in each sector to prevent a cyber attack. Companies that voluntarily implement those standards will be rewarded with immunity from punitive damages in a lawsuit, receipt of real-time cyber threat information, and expedited security clearances, among other things. This voluntary arrangement replaces the mandatory system in an early version of the bill. Many of us supported that approach, but in the spirit of compromise and responding to concerns expressed by the business community, the managers have included this voluntary approach. The Cybersecurity Act also authorizes voluntary information sharing. The sharing provision will allow government agencies and willing private companies to enhance the mutual understanding of the real threat and our vulnerabilities. Sharing this information on effective responses and recent cyber threats will enable both the government and the private sector to understand the threat and to respond. A handful of industries have already adopted this approach, and it significantly enhances their ability to identify and respond to cyber threats. We should empower the government to share its knowledge with these and other industries, and we should make it clear that the private companies can share cyber threat indicators with the government. That's exactly what this act does. I want to thank the presiding officer, Senator Franken of Minnesota, as well as Senators Coons, Blumenthal, Sanders, and Akaka for working with me and the managers to ensure that we protect privacy and civil liberties. The presiding officer is chair of the Privacy Subcommittee of Senate Judiciary. He's been a real leader on these issues. I was happy to work with him. As a result of his efforts and our efforts, the willingness of Senators Lieberman, Collins, Rockefeller, and Feinstein were able to significantly enhance the privacy and civil liberties protections in the revised bill. I believe, I've always believed, and I will continue to believe that we can keep America safe and free. We can establish in our democratic society the appropriate defense to any threat without sacrificing our fundamental constitutional rights. The revised bill after we negotiated with them, now requires that the government cybersecurity exchanges be operated by civilian agencies within the federal government. Our thinking was that these agencies are more prone to oversight, and any excesses by them will be caught earlier than if this is done on the military side, to be very blunt. Military and spy agencies should not be the first recipients of personal communications like emails, but from time to time they will need to be informed, and we need to rely on their expertise. That's why the bill requires that relevant cyber threat information be shared with these agencies as appropriate in real time. The revised bill eliminates immunities for companies that violate the privacy rights of Americans in a knowing, intentional, or grossly negligent manner. To ensure that cybersecurity exchanges are not used to circumvent the Fourth Amendment, the bill requires law enforcement to only use information from the cyber exchanges to stop cyber crimes, prevent imminent death or bodily harm to adults, or prevent exploitation of minors. The revised bill creates a vigorous structure for strong, recurring, and independent oversight to guarantee transparency and accountability. It gives individuals authority to sue the government for privacy violations to ensure compliance with the rules for protecting private information. These common sense reforms improve the information sharing section of the bill, and they protect the privacy. That's why they've been widely embraced across the political spectrum, from left to right. I think we found the sweet spot. I think we found the right balance. That kind of endorsement across the political spectrum suggests that's the case. Well, we're very vulnerable in the United States at this very moment. Our critical infrastructure is at risk, and billions of dollars worth of intellectual property is being stolen. Our national security is compromised. To put the cyber threat in perspective, General Keith Alexander, Director of the National Security Agency, was asked, how prepared is the United States for a cyber attack on a scale of 1 to 10, with 10 meaning we are the most prepared? What was his answer? 3. 3 out of 10. That's an alarming assessment. It's a failing grade by any standard. If we don't act now, we'll continue to be at risk for not only the loss of information and economic loss, but even worse, mass casualties, a crippled economy, a compromise of sensitive data. Mr. President, I know that this bill has some controversy associated with it, and I know that there are some in the business sector who think we've gone too far. I would plead with them, work with us. Let's do this, and do it now. To let this wait is to jeopardize the security of this country. We didn't think twice to respond quickly after the 9/11 attacks to make America safe. We see it everywhere we turn. If you can even imagine what life was like in the United States before 9/11, before you took your shoes off when you went to the airport, before searches were commonplace in American life, before armed guards stood outside the U.S. Capitol. Those are the realities of what we face today because of that attack. Let us be thoughtful. Let us be careful. Let us come together, the private and the public sector. Let us do this the right way to keep America safe. The people who sent us here to represent them expect no less. Mr. President, I ask the following statement be placed at a separate part of the record.
Without objection.
I see Senator Coons on the floor. I'd like to ask him if I could speak for a few more minutes. Is that consistent with your... Thank you very much. Mr. President, the Senate Health Committee released a report after completing a 2-year investigation of for-profit colleges. The 1,096-page report is the most comprehensive analysis yet and provides a broad picture of the for-profit college industry. What Senator Tom Harkin and the committee discovered and carefully documented is an industry driven by profit which too often has limited concern for the students or the actual learning process. The report profiles 30 of the biggest for-profit colleges, virtually from every state in the Union, including Illinois. There are good schools there, make no mistake, and my colleague Senator Harkin has been careful to point them out. But there are also some that are not making an effort. Some are trying to improve student outcomes, but unfortunately there are many of these for-profit schools that are just soaking in federal subsidies in the form of student aid so they can pay their shareholders extra money. DeVry is the 3rd largest for-profit college in the country. It's based in my state of Illinois. It operates 96 campuses, offers classes online. In 2010, DeVry had over 100,000 students an increase of 250% of enrollment in 10 years since the year 2000. It derives almost 80% of its revenue from the federal government. Like the other companies profiled in the report, DeVry's tuition is significantly higher than that of public colleges. The cost of tuition for a Bachelor of Science in Business Administration at DeVry's Chicago campus is $84,320 for a bachelor's degree, considerably more than the same program at the University of Illinois, where the four-year tuition is $75,000. DeVry looks good compared to many of its peers in the for-profit college sector. Unlike some other schools, DeVry's internal documents reveal the school has chosen not to use aggressive price increases in the future. I salute them for that. I've spoken to their leadership and told them that if they want to distance themselves from the pack of bad for-profit schools, they have to do it by actually making decisions and implementing them to demonstrate that they are a different kind of for-profit school. There are still areas where DeVry can make improvements. DeVry's institutional loan program, a private student loan program, charges a 12% interest rate. 12%. The federal government student loan, 3.4% in contrast. So this rate is roughly 3 times the federal loan. The HELP Committee estimates that in 2009, when all sources of federal taxpayer funds, including military and veterans benefits, are included, the 15 largest publicly traded for-profit education companies received 86% of their revenue from taxpayers. 86%. They're 14% away from being totally federal agencies. Perhaps this would be acceptable if students were really learning and gaining skills to succeed. But what the committee found is troubling. One of the main reasons student outcomes are so poor at these schools is that the schools don't provide students with basic support services that they need to find a job and succeed. Student support services are essential to helping students adapt and do well while they're in school and find a job. So what happens instead? They drop out. Or if they graduate, they can't find a job. In 2010, the 30 for-profit colleges examined employed 35,000 plus recruiters. 35,000 recruiters. The same schools collectively employed 3,500 career services staff and 12,452 support staff. So by a margin of 2.5 to 1, the schools had more recruiters than support service employees. So we can't be shocked when we learn that 500,000 students who enrolled in 2008, and 2009 left without a degree or a certificate by mid-2010. Among two-year associate degree holders, almost 2/3 of the students in these for-profit schools departed without a degree, just a debt. The report also highlighted a growing problem among for-profit colleges, the use of lead generators. For-profit colleges gather contact information of prospective students, or leads as they call them, by paying third-party companies known as lead generators. These generators specialize in gathering and selling information, in this case, very personal information. Here's how it works. A student browsing the Internet searches for the term like GI Bill, student loan, federal student aid, or any variation. They're directed to various websites that are owned by these lead generator companies. The website then claims to pass the prospective student contact into an appropriate school for the student online. Typically, there's no disclosure to the student that their personal information is being sold to for-profit colleges. When a prospective student does give their contact information, watch out. They will be bombarded with calls and emails from aggressive recruiters at these for-profit schools. Remember that 35,202 people employed as recruiters, this is what they do. One of the websites, GIBill.com, was owned by a company called QuinStreet until last month. 23 attorneys general across the United States did what Congress should have done first. As part of an agreement, QuinStreet gave up its right to the website that had rights to the website to the Veterans Administration, where it belongs. So GIBill.com is no longer a deceptive website, at least in these 23 states where there's been an agreement. Other websites use the name of federal student aid programs and mislead students into believing this is a real government program. One of the Health Committee's recommendations is to further regulate the private student loan market. Senator Harkin and I introduced the Know Before You Owe Private Student Loan Act this year. Our bill requires private student loan lenders to verify the prospective borrower's cost of attendance with the school before dispersing the loan. It also requires the schools to counsel students as to whether they're still eligible for federal student loans at a much lower interest rate. Federal student loans have flexible payment plans, consumer protections, and, as I said, less cost. But many times students who have not exhausted their federal student loan aid are steered into private loans with interest rates 3 and 4 times higher. There's money to be made off those young, sometimes uninformed students. I urge the private lenders today and the for-profit schools that keep telling me we are doing the right thing, don't wait for this law. Do it now. Make this a policy at your school and prove it. One of the students that I wanted to mention is Morella Tovar from Blue Island, Illinois. She graduated from Columbia College in 2010 with a BA in graphic design and with $90,000 in debt and with a 10.25% interest rate. Well, her balance started to grow. She didn't take out any federal loans. She thought all the loans were the same. She just didn't know the difference. No one told her about the consumer protections in the federal loans. After she used her 6-month forbearance permitted by her lender, Morella was expected to pay $1,500 a month. Unable to get a full-time job in her field, she thought about filing for bankruptcy. Wouldn't have done her any good. Student loans are not dischargeable in bankruptcy, even if they come from these for-profit colleges. Her dad wanted to help her out, so he co-signed her private student loans. Guess what? Dad's now on the hook for the payments, too. Morella says if there was a school counselor who would have told her more about her monthly payments, she wouldn't have gotten in so deeply. If she'd been counseled on the Know Before You Owe Private Loan Act, she may have never been steered to a private student loan. I want to thank Senator Harkin for his leadership and amazing work on this issue. And I want to plead with my colleagues, on behalf of these students and their families, on behalf of taxpayers who are subsidizing these schools, join us in setting standards so that there's an opportunity for children, young people, to get the education they need without inheriting the debts that can drag them down for a lifetime. Mr. President, I yield the floor.
The Senator from Georgia.
I ask unanimous consent to address the Senate as if in morning business.
Without objection.
Mr. President, this morning I got some very sad news. The state of Georgia and the people of my state lost a giant in the healthcare industry. Tim Stack was my friend. He was also the president of the hospital that 2 years ago treated me well, which is why I'm standing here today. He was a giant in healthcare, not just in Georgia, but in America. So on behalf of myself and all the citizens of my state and the countless thousands of patients whose lives have been made better or even saved by Tim Stack, I want to send my condolences to his wife, Mary, and his 3 sons, Ryan, Tim, and Matthew. Tim Stack grew up in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, working in the steel mills. And when the mills closed, he looked to find a job, and he worked in the central supply at the Eye and Ear Hospital of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. He was working to go to college to study to be a teacher and a football coach. But by working in the hospital, he became fascinated with the complexity of a hospital administration and also challenged by the love of caring for people who were ill. So Tim Stack changed his major to hospital administration and became a leader in the United States in the administration of hospitals. Let me read you his record in Atlanta, Georgia alone. Under his leadership, Piedmont Healthcare grew from 2 hospitals and 8 physician practices to a $1.6 billion organization that included 5 hospitals, more than 50 primary care and specialty physician practices, a 900-member clinically integrated network, and the Piedmont Heart Institute, which treated me 2 years ago, and it's the reason I'm standing here today, which is the leading heart institute, not just in Atlanta and in my state of Georgia, but throughout the United States of America. Tim is one of a kind, and his loss will be felt by countless thousands of Georgians. To his family, to his friends who all that knew him, I express my sympathy. But for the Senate, I'd like you to know really what Tim Stack was all about, so I want to read a quote from Tim. It was written in 2006 when he was interviewed by Atlanta Hospital News for a profile. Tim wrote the following: "The attributes of a good leader are universal. You need to love what you do, be open and inquisitive and persistent, not afraid to make waves if you have to. You should also be personally productive and work well with others. Be innovative and allow others to innovate. Finally, be a certified member of the human race. Cultivate a light touch. Be passionate about your career, but be sure to balance it with the rest of your life. That expresses better than I can what Tim Stack was all about. I shall miss my friend Tim Stack greatly, as will all of my state of Georgia, and I send my condolences and sympathy to his wife, Mary, and his 3 sons, Ryan, Tim, and Matthew. And I yield back.
Mr. President.
Senator from Delaware.
Mr. President, I rise today to speak to the issue of cybersecurity, one where there's been a dozen speeches given earlier today, and one where I'm concerned there's not enough determination, there's not enough will on the part of this body to work together, to listen to each other, to cross the small differences that remain between camps and competing theories of a bill that we should take up. And I'm here to urge our colleagues in this body to address what we've been told is one of the greatest security threats facing our country, to bear down, to file amendments, to clear amendments, to listen to other members, and to be willing to do the job for which we were hired, which is to pass tough, broad, bipartisan legislation to protect this country we love. In my short 20 months in the Senate, Mr. President, I've increasingly become more and more persuaded that we face a constant, steadily rising, increasingly dangerous threat, that foreign nations, foreign actors, whether they be terrorists or enemies of the United States, are not just studying the possibility of someday attacking the critical infrastructure of the United States. They're not just writing position papers. They're not just theorizing about it. They're not just training in some camp in an obscure country. They are today actively engaged in thousands of efforts to compromise the critical infrastructure of this country. How members of this body can ignore the importance of this threat when the majority leader and the Republican leader have twice, in my short time here, closed the Senate and urged every one of us to go to a secure classified briefing where we have heard from a dozen four-star generals and leaders of three-letter agencies who have told us in great detail about how grave this threat is. Why, in the face of repeated and publicly cited assertions by secretaries of defense, by heads of the NSA, leaders of our Homeland Security Agency, and leaders who are responsible for our first responder community from the federal to the state to the local level, from the private sector to this government, have said over and over, this is a very real, very present threat. How we can ignore that threat today is beyond me. The bill which is before us is S-3414. This is a compromise bill. And in a series of meetings with other members of this body, I have been struck to hear others say, we need more time. We need to study this further. We need to pass the narrow portions on information sharing, which are easy and everyone can now agree on, and we need not pass a broader or stronger bipartisan bill that deals with infrastructure. As you know well, Mr. President, for years, critical committees in this body have been working on this issue. Senators Lieberman and Collins, the chair and the ranking on Homeland Security and Government Affairs, have been engaged in working their way through these difficult issues for years. And the relevant committees from Energy to Commerce to Intelligence have been engaged in hearings and in study and in legislating for years before I became a senator. In the last few months, there's been some important and strong work to build a bipartisan consensus around the bill that is before us today. I, like you, I believe, Mr. President, had some real concerns about the information sharing portions of the bill, Title VII, which have to do with permitting private companies to share information with each other about the threats of attacks. One of our big problems right now, we're told, is that companies of all different sectors in our economy hesitate to share publicly or to share with our national security infrastructure information that's critical to knowing when we're being attacked, how we're being attacked, and how that attack might spread. So Title VII of this bill gives them liability protection to encourage the broad and regular sharing of that information. But those of us who are concerned about the balance between privacy and security, about protecting civil liberties, and whether or not we've gone too far in seeking security at the expense of liberty, offered a whole series of revisions and changes to this bill, changes which have been accepted. So, too, in a different section of the bill, Title I, that has to deal with critical infrastructure, folks from the private sector raised alarms and concerns months ago that this bill was too prescriptive, too heavy-handed, was involved too much in regulation and in demanding certain actions by the private sector. Those concerns, too, have been addressed, I think, in a broad way. And I have been impressed with how many changes Senators Lieberman and Collins have been willing to accept out of a broad working group of more than a dozen senators of both parties who over the last few months have come forward with suggestions that have made that portion of the bill truly voluntary for the private sector in a way that balances the role of civilian agencies with parts of our national security apparatus in a way that provides enough liability protection but not too much, and in a way that allows the private sector to have a leading role in setting standards. My point then, Mr. President, is to say to my colleagues in this body that when they say we need more time to study, I say we need to come to this bill. We need to come to the floor. We need our colleagues to be clear. What are your remaining concerns? In a meeting last Friday with several senators and representatives of industry, I had read every word of Title VII and urged them to be concrete with us about what their concerns were. And I left unsatisfied. I left concerned that some were simply scaring the private sector, some were simply scaring our citizens into thinking this bill is not ready. So for those who still have concerns, and there may very well be broad and legitimate concerns about this bill and about its direction, let's take these 2 days. I understand that more than 90 amendments have been filed. I think it is the challenge before us to make the amendments germane, narrowly focused, and relevant to improve the bill rather than distracting us into issues that are more partisan or more tied to the campaign, and to focus on the work that is left before us. Mr. President, if I could, I am gravely concerned about those who would urge us to split off the portion of the bill on information sharing and ignore the portion of the bill that has to do with protecting our critical infrastructure. As speaker after speaker has come to this floor today and made clear, our electricity grid is at risk, our dams and our power plants are at risk, our highways and our financial system are at risk. There are all sorts of areas in the United States where there have been real cyber attacks, online attacks in other countries that have demonstrated the devastating potential power of our opponents and enemies around the world. In the face of the cautionary notes we've heard from leaders of this body and around the country, and in face of that very strong reality, why we wouldn't pass a broad and tough bill that facilitates information sharing and protects our critical infrastructure and strikes a fair balance in the middle is beyond me. It is not that this body has been too busy. It is not that we are exhausted by having passed too many broad and strong bipartisan bills. We've gotten good work done this session. There are things, from the Farm Bill to the Transportation Bill, where this body has shown an ability to listen to each other across the differences of party and region and craft strong, balanced bipartisan bills. It is on this topic, on cybersecurity, that we have heard over and over there is no more pressing challenge. Why, if our adversaries are not going to be taking the month of August off? Why, if our adversaries are not going to cease from now to November to attack us, would we not bear down and focus on getting done the work that is before us as the United States Senate? We are called at times the world's greatest deliberative body. And I'll say to you as a member of the Foreign Relations Committee that in other parts of the world, there are folks who are striving towards democracy who question whether this is the model they should follow. Why not, in the remaining days before we all go to some recess, why not bear down, do our homework, do our reading, be forthcoming with clear and concise concerns, and hammer out our differences? Mr. President, I extend an invitation to any of my colleagues, to any industry group, to any group of concerned citizens. I am happy to meet with anyone, to hear their concerns, to try and do my level best to convey them to the bill managers, to the leaders who have done such a remarkable job of hearing and accepting compromise provisions of this bill on privacy, on the role of the private sector, on making voluntary what was mandatory, on striking a fair balance. I urge our colleagues to take this moment seriously, to not allow the days to slip, the month to pass, and the moment to pass us by. How will we answer our constituents, our communities, and our families following an attack that has been so frequently predicted? And do we not believe that we will end up regulating in a more heavy-handed, more reactionary, more ill-informed way after a successful, massive attack than now, when we have the time to listen to each other and craft a balanced and responsible and bipartisan bill? Mr. President, I will close with this. I am convinced this is the gravest threat facing our country today, graver than that of terrorism from overseas. In fact, General Keith Alexander of the NSA has clarified just in the last few days to a group of us how grave a threat this is. I renew my offer to any member of this chamber. Come and meet with me. Come and meet with Senators Lieberman and Collins. Come and meet with the leaders of the relevant committees. Take up your cause and give an amendment that is narrow and focused and relevant, and let us hammer out a better defense for this nation. There are those who question the purpose and purposefulness of this body. It has no greater purpose than finding a bipartisan way to craft a strong and vibrant solution to a clear and growing national threat. Just a few weeks ago, I had the honor of sitting for lunch with Senator Daniel Inouye. He is the one member of this body to have earned the Congressional Medal of Honor in combat. I asked his advice as the most senior member of my party. What issues, Senator Inouye, I asked of him, do you think I should be focused on? What is the thing you might urge me, a freshman, to invest my time and effort into? And his answer was simple, and his answer was profound, and his answer, I hope, will be heard by this body. He said to me, I am the only senator who was at Pearl Harbor. Our next Pearl Harbor will come from a cyber attack for which we are today unprepared. Let us do our duty. Let us listen to each other, come together, hammer out a strong and bipartisan bill, and honor the service and sacrifice of that greatest generation, both in this chamber and our country, and do our duty. Madam President, I yield the floor.
Madam President.
Senator from Colorado.
Madam President, before I turn to the matter that brought me to the floor, I want to acknowledge the powerful and eloquent words of my colleague from Delaware. I know that our colleague, Senator Collins, is also on the floor, and I have to tell the viewers and all of my colleagues, I couldn't agree more. The time is now to act on cybersecurity. I just came to the floor from an Intelligence Committee briefing. General Alexander was there, and as the senator from Delaware knows, he's forthright, he's well-versed, he's passionate, he's as nonpartisan as they come, and General Alexander is urging us to act now. So I want to thank my colleague from Delaware for his compelling and important words. The matter that brought me to the floor has a link to cybersecurity, and that is, if you will, energy security. And I want to talk about one of the new exciting technologies that's resulting in the production of many, many homegrown electrons, and that's wind power. And, Madam President, I've come to the floor on a daily basis to urge my colleagues to work with me to extend the production tax credit for wind. The PTC has created literally tens of thousands of jobs across our country and has the potential to create even more. But if Congress, and that's us, that's the Senate, and that's the House, doesn't act to extend it, tens of thousands of jobs literally will be lost. I know the presiding officer has a robust wind energy sector in her state, and she knows the extent to which it's important to business in the great state of New Hampshire. It's important to the businesses in every state in our country. It's an investment in a clean energy future, the production tax credit is. It's a critical investment in American jobs, and frankly, we're about to lose that investment. And I fear, in fact, that we've continued through our inaction to create real harm to our wind industry here in America. But it's not too late to act, Madam President. So today I'm going to focus my remarks on Idaho, a state that's known for its wide open spaces, its mountains, its potatoes, for great friendly people. You don't have to look any further than Senator Crapo and Senator Risch to know that the people of Idaho are very, very good people. Idaho is a state with a vast potential, vast untapped potential for wind energy. The National Renewable Energy Laboratory, which we host in Colorado, has calculated that Idaho's wind resources could potentially provide more than 218% of Idaho's electricity needs. It ranks 23rd in our nation wind resource potential. Now, most of this potential is on the high plains of the southern half of the state. And I have to tell you that Idaho is already working to take advantage of what's a bountiful resource. There are more than 20 separate wind projects either online or under construction across the state. And if you look, Madam President, in southeastern Utah near Twin Falls, here the Wolverine Creek Wind Farm, Invenergy's project, it covers about 5,000 acres, and it pays royalties to almost 30 different landowners. In 2011, Idaho's installed wind capacity grew by nearly 75%. That growth created hundreds of temporary construction jobs as well as permanent jobs in operation and maintenance of these facilities. Another number, right now Idaho's wind resources provide power for nearly 160,000 homes without releasing the nearly 1.1 million metric tons of carbon dioxide that traditional power sources would. Wind supports close to 500 jobs in the state of Idaho, jobs that wouldn't exist if the wind industry had not been enticed to invest in Idaho because of the production tax credit, the PTC. And wind energy projects are an investment in local and state economies. Wind energy producers provide nearly $2.5 million to the state in property tax payments every year and over $2 million annually in land lease payments to local Idahoans who go on and invest that money back into their local communities. Those are real dollars that these communities count on. So, Madam President, the point I'm trying to make is that we in the Congress should be working to help create more projects like Wolverine Creek for the jobs and the clean energy that they create. But instead, the Congress is standing idly by. And then, Madam President, I can't help but mention that there have been some on the campaign trail who've suggested that we should let the wind production tax credit lapse at the end of this year and that wind power should not be given the same help that other industries have received. I could not disagree more. Great states like Idaho and Colorado and New Hampshire make things. Great countries like the United States generate their own energy. Letting the wind production tax credit lapse would be irresponsible. The PTC equals jobs. We should pass it as soon as possible. We should not waver, and we should not wait. Every day that we let this unanswered question hang over our country, Madam President, may be another project and another job that gets shipped overseas. I urge my colleagues to work with me to support manufacturing in rural communities right here in America. Let's extend the production tax credit as soon as possible. It's common sense. It has bipartisan support. let's extend the production tax credit. Madam President, I'll be back tomorrow to continue this discussion and talk about another one of our great states. I'm at 13 states. I'm going to keep coming back until we get this right. Thank you, Madam President. I yield the floor.
Madam President.
The senator from Minnesota.
Madam President, I ask to speak as if in morning business.
Without objection.
Madam President, over the last few weeks, hundreds of thousands of Minnesotans have received letters or postcards in the mail from their health care insurers. These notices are letting people know whether or not their insurer met a new rule in the health care law, a rule that I championed, called the medical loss ratio, sometimes called the 80-20 rule. It could also be called the 85-15 rule, but it's known as the 80-20 rule, and I'll explain. This provision, which I based on a Minnesota state law, requires large group insurers to spend 85% of the premiums that they receive from their beneficiaries on actual health care services. They have to spend 85% of the premiums they receive on actual health care services, not on marketing or administrative costs or CEO salaries. These dollars, 85% of their premium dollars have to be spent on actual health care. And for insurers in the small group and individual markets, this threshold is 80%, hence the 80-20 rule. So this summer across the country, Americans are getting notices from their insurers that the insurer met or did not meet this 80 or 85% threshold. And when those notices say that the insurer failed to meet the medical loss ratio, Americans are also getting something else in the mail, a check or lower premiums for next year, because under my medical loss ratio provision, insurers who do not spend at least the 80 or the 85% of premiums on actual health care services for their beneficiaries have to rebate that money to their consumers. August 1st was the deadline for insurers who didn't meet the MLR threshold to rebate the difference to their consumers. And because of the medical loss ratio, more than 123,000 Minnesotans got rebates from their insurer. Those rebates added up to an average of $160 per household. It was more in other states. This isn't unique to Minnesota. Across the country, it was 12.8 million Americans got rebates from their insurers who overcharged them. And other insurers lowered their premiums for last year to comply with the medical loss ratio. Aetna in Connecticut lowered premiums by 10% last year because of the MLR. Minnesota has a culture of high-quality, low-cost care. In fact, the Agency for Health Care Research and Quality recently announced that in 2011, Minnesota's health care quality was the highest in the nation. We were #1 again. We're always number one or number two or number three. And the medical loss ratio, which was first passed as a Minnesota state law, is yet another example of Minnesota's leadership in bringing down health care costs while preserving quality. Minnesota's unique health care culture includes the Mayo Clinic, cooperative models like Health Partners, and visionary public health leadership from state legislators. Health care in our state is also distinguished by the fact that 90% of Minnesotans are served by a non-profit health plan. These plans outperform their national peers and are able to put 91% of every premium dollar toward actual health services. In other words, they have a 91 MLR. By taking profits out of the health insurance industry, Minnesota health plans do a better job helping our residents live longer, healthier lives and deliver the #1 quality care in the nation. And the medical loss ratio within the health reform law is holding all health plans to the same standards we've set in Minnesota by requiring that 80 to 85% of premium dollars actually pay for health services. Before this year, in other plans throughout the nation, less than 60% of your premiums were put toward health care. The rest was being used for administrative costs, for marketing, for bonuses, and for profits. In fact, one study of insurers in Texas a few years ago showed MLRs, medical loss ratios, as low as 22%, meaning that of all the premiums that families are paying into their insurers, the insurers were spending only 22% on actual health care services for them. And that's why my medical loss ratio provision is so important. It squeezes the fat out of the health insurance market and makes your premium dollars go further. For many families, it's actually lowering costs, delivering $1.1 billion this year in rebates. Those checks, $1.1 billion. And in addition, lowering premiums. For example, the 10% reduction by Aetna in Connecticut. This was an incredibly important step because we know premiums were going up way too fast, a lot faster than those families' income. This is just one way that the health care law is already changing the culture of care in our country. One of the other things that the law did was move toward rewarding quality of care, not quantity of care. Specifically, it directed Medicare to start paying doctors based on the value of the care they provide, not the volume. This is a provision that I and Senator Klobuchar and several other of our colleagues championed, called the Value Index. Because when Minnesota doctors get paid less for providing higher quality care, everyone loses. Minnesota loses because Minnesota reimburses 50% less per Medicare patient, on average, in Minnesota than for each patient, on average, in Texas. So Minnesota actually gets punished. It gets punished for being #1. It gets punished for higher quality care with lower reimbursements. Patients in Texas lose because they're not getting the highest value care for their health care dollar, and all taxpayers lose when Medicare pays for unnecessary or overpriced services in Texas and in other low-value states. This is not about pitting Minnesota against Texas or other low-value states. It's about incentivizing the Texases to be more like Minnesota, which again has the highest health care quality in the nation. And that will happen when the value, and that's will begin to happen when the value index kicks in. under this law. It would be an understatement to say that the law has received some attention this year, and I know that there's a lot of uncertainty among our constituents about how the law will affect them. That's because sometimes there's a little misinformation put out there. I just had a colleague say that there's nothing in the bill to address paperwork, and that is certainly not true. In fact, I authored a provision on simplifying billing. There was some misinformation on why the IRS agents are there to look into your insurance rather than emphasis on anything done in the bill, in the law, to address workforce shortages. Well, that's not true. There's an entire title on workforce. You know, sometimes people have to really sort out what's being said on this floor. So there's some uncertainty. So let me just take a moment to talk about just a few of the other things that the law is already doing for the people of Minnesota. And this stuff is all in the law and happening. And I'm just telling what's going on right now. Now, first of all, starting tomorrow, August 1st, 900,000 women in Minnesota and 47 million women around the country will have free access to preventive health services, including gestational diabetes screenings, preventive health visits with their doctors, and FDA-approved contraceptives. Because of the health care law, women, not insurance companies, can now make decisions about their health care and can access the services that will keep them healthy. The health care law is also helping families in Minnesota and across the country by prohibiting insurers from denying health coverage for children who have pre-existing conditions. I've met children who are alive today because of this provision. And as a parent, I know how grateful their parents are. Parents around the country can now sleep a little easier knowing that if their child gets sick, they'll still be able to get the health care coverage they need. We should be celebrating that. You know, this isn't about putting the government between you and your doctor, as I hear sometimes. This is about getting the insurance company out of the way and making sure that children can get coverage, and adults. We have seen the elimination of lifetime limits on care. Your insurance company can no longer put an arbitrary cap on your care. I've seen a gentleman whose life was saved because of this. Because before this law came into being, they could drop you. And they did. And that's over. That's done. People don't have to worry about hitting an arbitrary limit and then being thrown off their insurance because they have. We should be celebrating that. That's something that should be creating a lot of relief for people, and that's why we're going to be having far, 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 far fewer bankruptcies. Parents will also be relieved to know that young adults can now have been able to stay on their parents' health care plan until the age of 26 because of this provision. 35,000 young adults in Minnesota are now insured on their parents' policy. Seniors. I was at a senior center in Woodbury the other day. And the seniors are very happy with the changes that the health care law has made. When I visit senior centers in Minnesota, I hear relief from seniors who now can pay for their medications thanks to the provision in the health care law, which is closing the donut hole. The provision has already allowed 57,000 seniors in Minnesota to receive a 50% discount on their covered brand name prescription drugs when they hit the so-called donut hole, at an average of $590 savings per person. And I can see the presiding officer nodding. I know you go to senior centers in New Hampshire and know that when seniors hear that people want to repeal this, they're miffed. I've actually been at a senior center where they went, what can we do? And like wanted to get up and go out and start being activists for the health care law when they heard that some of my friends want to repeal this. Because some of them are just, they're making it just on Social Security, and now the donut hole is closing and they like that. And it means that they can take their medication. And it means they don't have to take it every other day, or they don't have to cut it in half. And my friends on the other side want to repeal it. Seniors are also getting free preventive health services under the health care law, like mammograms, colonoscopies, as well as free annual wellness visits with their doctor, and boy, do they like that. Listen, I could go on and on, I won't. But the point is that because of the law, more people are getting care, the quality of our care is better, and we're lowering costs, and I am proud of that. As we here in the Senate head home to spend August in our states, I urge my colleagues to listen, as I do, when constituents tell us about the rebates they received. I was on a plane 2 weekends ago. A woman showed me her check. The woman I was sitting next to showed me her rebate check. So I urge my colleagues to listen to constituents talk about the rebates they receive, the kids who are able to stay on their parents' insurance, the health screenings that save the lives of grandparents. I hope they will listen to the stories of kids with pre-existing conditions who are finally able to get coverage, and seniors who are able to afford both their prescriptions and their dinner. I urge my colleagues to acknowledge these benefits and to support the continued implementation of the Affordable Care Act. Thank you, Madam President, and I yield the floor.
Madam President.
The senator from Delaware.
Madam President, I think there's several people here who would like to be recognized. I think Senator Collins would like to be recognized. If she's ready to go, I'll yield to her.